Welcome to the Cybersecurity Simplified podcast, where we take the mystery out of today's top security threats and solutions. SIEM has been a cybersecurity standard as far back as 2005. Its job is to collect, correlate, and analyze data from disparate sources for use in risk detection and forensic investigation. Now, over the last 2 decades, SIEM has evolved to leverage advances like big data analytics and AI to process more data faster. But today's guest says SIEM has a fatal flaw. Chris Jordan, CEO of Fluency Corp, says SIEM's database-centric design causes critical delays in early detection and rapid response. So what's the solution? Stay tuned as Jordan shares breakthroughs in streaming analytics and the future of SIEM. Hello. Welcome back to Cybersecurity Simplified. My name is Susanna Song, co-host of the podcast. How are you, Dave?
Good. I'm Dave Barton, also the co-host of this phenomenal podcast.
Yeah, we're already at episode 50. So we made it to the 50 mark.
That's huge. That's a huge milestone for us.
Yeah. And today we're going to be discussing what data flow means to the future of SIEM. So let's bring in our guest, Chris Jordan, or as I refer to as Jordan in the intro. How are you, Chris?
Doing great. Good to hear from you.
Yeah. So welcome to the podcast. And actually, both of you being veteran security practitioners, I want to throw out this first question to the both of you. And that's because one of the differentiators of our podcast is that we stay away from technical jargon. And right off the bat, we said SIEM. And if you've been in the security world, SIEM is well known to you. It's nothing new to you. And in the other camp, we've got some new newbies who are just getting started in cybersecurity, so they may be confused what SIEM stands for. So SIEM is an acronym for Security Information and Event Management. So what I want to know from you guys is, how do businesses use this platform?
So I'll jump in first. This technology really started in very large companies, Susanna, and for our listeners, to correlate and try to get a handle on how do we detect bad things happen. And so if you go look at like our podcast last week, the gentleman we had on said there's 5,000 security products or some number. I don't remember exactly what number he said, but every one of those products generate a log of some sort. And if you think about the average security team in a Fortune 500, they're dealing with 50 plus tools, right? And so the challenge is, how do you have enough people to look at all the tools, to look at all the logs, to find the bad things that are happening? And years ago, when I worked for Sprint, we came to the conclusion that you can't. You have to have something to aggregate the data and some query language to go look at the data to find the needles. And so the short answer to your question is, we are seeing companies of all sizes, especially in regulated industries, that have a requirement that says, thou shalt store logs and review them for security events. And that's really what we're getting to. And we'll talk about the evolution here in a minute, but that's how every company of every size who has to have log correlation, log storage is doing it, is with a SIEM technology.
Chris
That's
is
a pretty
nodding.
solid breakdown. Yeah, it's a pretty solid breakdown. I know, nodding on an audio cast. So really, if you think about it, there's two things that Dave talked about. The first one is actually getting your work done. I want to be secure. So that does require collecting all your data and reviewing it to see what might be wrong and how can I fix it. That's the pure play of people that really care about security. Now, there's the other play, which is compliance. And there's a lot of compliance out there, whether it's CMMC, which is the government compliance for anybody who's a contractor to the federal government, all the way to PCI security, which is your credit card security, HIPAA, which is your healthcare. All of these requirements talk about having a single aggregated view for all your data, required to be reviewed minimum daily. for most organizations and stored 90 days hot and for a full year cold. So that's the basic compliance requirements. And so companies really are doing two things when they're looking at a SIEM or any aggregate. They're trying to collect all this data to review it to be a good security posture, but at the same side, they have to demonstrate they're doing all this for their compliance, and that compliance is to maintain their customer relationships. So it's an interesting kind of thing. We can go the fear route, oh, you got to review it or else you're going to get hacked, or we go the compliance route. But those are the two main reasons why people use SIEMs.
So what is your thought on next? We often hear, and I'm in marketing, that there's that evolution, the next generation of SIEM, and often, we talk about the extended detection and response, that there's a better way, a more innovative way to do SIEM or to leverage SIEM. So do you guys think SIEM is dead?
No. No, I'll jump in first again, Chris, because you'll have a lot more interesting things to say than I will. Susanna, we talked about the evolution of SIEM, and early on, back to my Sprint days again, we were looking at flat files and maybe some syslog out of firewalls, and that was the extent of it. And then came relational databases and the ability to correlate other multiple log sources. And that's really Gen 2. And that's where you saw the Splunks and the QRadar and logarithms, those companies start to grow the market share because they saw the need for correlating an event on a server with a firewall event and being able to tie those together. And that really is where the genesis of XDR. And now we're going to go down this path of another iteration or another generational leap from data lake technology. And I'll let Chris explain why this isn't working, to observability pipelines. And this is really where I see Gen 3 coming out in the SIEM space, doing real-time analytics and then firing detections off of what we see in real time, which lead to better automations, which lead to, at the end of the day, we're trying to manage an outcome, right? Mm-hmm. The quicker we catch the bad guy trying to break in your house, the quicker we get rid of him, right? And that is our goal. And observability pipelines, this Gen 3 of SIEM technology, is, I think, how we get there. Chris, I know you've got more or better stories about it.
Yeah. I might be the pessimist. So I kind of say that the knowledge of people would have about SIEM today, that type of SIEM is dead, in the sense that you brought it up, database and stuff like that. So if you think of the evolution, is at first we just had a hard time getting the data. Then we increased the amount of function we had, and therefore we couldn't use flat files anymore. We needed to do something more flexible. But what happened is data doubles every 2 years. So if you think back in 2003, start doubling every 2 years, and you've got 10 doubles. You're at 1 to 2% of what you used to be able to do, right? In other words, you can't do it. If you can barely survive looking at your data today, if you don't like the speed of your query today, you're not going to like it 2 years from now. In fact, you probably can't function 2 years from now. And so a lot of SIEMs right now are dying on the vine as the information increases. And that information is just not increasing. Think about EDR, right? I'm sure on one of your previous episodes, we talked about endpoint detection and response. And the big difference here is, instead of looking for malicious files, we're capturing all the actions of a user and then analyzing that both on the system and in the cloud. So there's a tremendous amount of data increasing just on the products alone. And then on top of it, you look at cloud computation. That is growing exponentially, right? Now, every time a processor runs, it generates a log, more data. Mm-hmm. So we're getting more and more and more data. So imagine this massive explosion of data. And it's in many different places. So now I've got to collect all this data continuously, not just once a day, but nonstop. Mm-hmm. And so then I have to process, analyze it, detect something, and have enough information to respond to it.
And that takes time.
So this is not,
right?
It takes time, it takes money, because it's all processing power and storage. This is not an easy thing. And what we've been doing, the easy button, throw it in a database and keep on doing it over and over and over again. And the system's now broken. We can't do it. Think about the Sigma rules. There's 2,000 signatures that you want to search. Each one takes 10 minutes. Just that's 10 minutes times 2,000. You don't have that many minutes in a day,
No.
right? And so you can't perform it the same way you used to, right? There's too many things you're searching for, and there's too much data. So what we have to say is that searching is not going to work. And so the best analogy I can give you about the difference between searching and moving left of the database, which you might call watching, is imagine you're a bouncer at a bar and people come into that bar. You don't want to close the door and say, hey, everybody stop, and start counting everybody to see if you're over your fire limit of, let's say, 50 people. What you want to do is you have a little clicker, and when people walk in, you click it. You start with an empty room, and you start clicking, and when they leave, you decrement the click. And so when people show up and they say, how many's in your party, you can look at the clicker and say, I know exactly how many people. I don't have to close the door, stop everything. And that's actually how a database works. The database stops so that you can perform your queries. And so now this moving left to the database, you do way, way more. You can analyze things at rest. This is like, what's that law of centrifugal motion? Things at rest, it takes a lot more energy to put energy back into it. So you can take it off the disk, analyze it, and then put it back on the disk and repeat that process over and over again. It's kind of dumb, right? So the reason why we've never really done it this way is, well, because we never really thought of trying to do it this way. But we were doing this way at some times. You think about the old days, some of us are old, when Snort was out, it was analyzing everything on the fly, right? But we're not doing that anymore. We're not doing streaming analysis anymore in the SIEM world. And because of that, everything is really coming to a break. We can't do it. And there's only time you ever really need to save stuff is when there's a problem and you need to investigate it. So the threat analysis, yes, I need to analyze that data. That data has to be stored, so I'm going to pull it up, but not for alerting and not for management of data as it comes in.
Yeah, and I think I'm just going to dovetail on that. The thing I want to make sure our listeners understand is what we're talking about is instead of writing the data to a disk, which has some inherent latency into it, we are going to evaluate the data as it traverses the network in real time. And we're going to apply all of our detections to that data in real time. And why that matters, just to give you just a quick example, in Office 365, Microsoft limits how quickly we can pull the API to find bad behaviors. Right? Everybody in the world has a 5-minute timer. So imagine we're pulling down thousands of tenants of data every 5 minutes, and at 5:01 an event happens. We've got to wait 5 minutes to see it or just to pull it. And then if we have to wait to write it to disk, we're looking at another 5 to 10 minutes. And then the query has to run. Now, what Chris didn't talk about is the more data we throw into a data lake doesn't make it better. It makes more data that we have to query. And so when you run a query against those 1,000 tenants that you're pulling every 5 minutes out of Microsoft, your query might finish by the time the next API call happens. So now you've got analysts scrambling to respond to the query, maybe, assuming you catch it. And, I think on top of all of that, you've got that inherent delay, which means you're not going to see an event, provided you catch it, within 10 to 15 minutes, right? And now your response plan kicks off. How do most SOCs handle that? They set a threshold. They say, if the risk score is below 60, we're not going to look at it. Mm-hmm. If it's between 60 and 80, we'll look at it every 10 minutes or 15 minutes. If it's 80 and above, we'll look at it right now. And so imagine all those risk scores that are under 60 that aren't getting looked at. That's a problem. Mm-hmm. If I can look at it in real time, I can evaluate every alert. I can quantify risk on that alert and then run an automation to go remediate that problem. And so, or mitigate that problem. And therein lies the problem with every data lake, database based SIEM technology on the market.
Yeah. I mean, you need that database, but you need that streaming analytics, that real-time continuous watching, mm-hmm. as you say, Chris, right? And by the way, I use that mm-hmm. analogy with someone. I was talking to someone about your business, Chris, and your technology. And it's I was getting a little too technical, and then I talked about the bouncer at the door of the club with the clicker, and she was like, "Yes, I get it. I get the difference between
Right.
the searching after you close the door, and then takes 20 minutes or however long to count all the activity or threats or people, right? Versus having that clicker, knowing exactly who went through your door,
Right.
right? That's that's a great analogy. So how would you describe streaming analytics? Because how you both of you explained it, every company should be using this kind of technology. So how difficult is streaming analytics, and why aren't more businesses and companies using it?
So the first problem with just business in general is when you have a product and you're selling it, it's very difficult to come up with a new version that has a completely different way of doing things.
Right.
Let's go back to like the kingpin of our industry, Splunk. Splunk actually still has flat files. This flat files with a MongoDB indexing system on top of it, so a database indexing system. So it's very, very old, and they're not improving it because that's how they make their money. They really can't change that back end engine. So that's one problem of our industry is that we kind of get in a quagmire where I can't change directions because I already have my customer base. And that's one issue that we have in our industry. The other one is that just doing streaming analytics does change the way you do things. But the problem with it is, or not the problem, the reality is we've actually changed the way we collect data. So we used to collect data on the machines, and we used to, pull the machines, and we used to DAT files. But that all changed when CrowdStrike came out with Falcon, and we were directly connecting across the internet and pulling the data live. Everybody started doing that. And so the industry really changed very quickly overnight from one where everything was very difficult to get the data to now we could get tons of data. And then you add all the cloud capabilities, like with AWS, you have CloudWatch, CloudTrail, GuardDuty. All that stuff is available streaming and coming in. Mm-hmm. So now you have a lot of data coming in nonstop. That's one thing that's really changed, is the data actually is easier to get and there's more of it. The other issue, though, is that there's two things going on. You can write an API call, which is basically a way, just a script, and say, I want to grab this data. But there's this other issue that you need to do it over and over and over again. That's what streaming is all about. And so you actually have two problems that you're trying to solve. One is the one we've been talking about, searching the data or watching the data, analyzing the data. But the other one is maintaining this infrastructure. And that's been the big roadblock for most of the other companies, is actually creating an infrastructure that's always on. Because you think about it, I can't just collect my data once a day. Mm-hmm. I have to collect it every second or every minute. This means that I have to have an infrastructure that I'm watching that keeps up and running, that's separate than the data it's pulling in. And then I'm watching that data on top of it. So you can see that it's not as simple as we really wish it was. It's actually a very complicated thing to do. But the results are better and it scales better. And yes, the industry it's already beginning to change this way already. It's going to have to change this way.
So what does that mean to the end customer, having a process where it's always in real time, it's kinetic, it's continuous?
It changes. One thing is, there's one tool that we haven't talked about, which is security orchestration and response. It's a separate piece of software that helps review your information better. Later on, we can talk about AI improvements to that. But it's going to analyze that data and it's going to handle response in an automated fashion. But remember what Dave said, what happens when I'm doing my search every 10 minutes, every 1 hour, any 24 hours? You're automating something that occurred at the best case,
in the best
10 minutes ago.
Right.
Okay. So how are you automating a response for something that's already done its damage? This is a massive lie in our industry. We have to move to streaming analytics because if we want to do automated response, we kind of want to respond while it's happening, not the next day.
Yeah.
And if you go to Chronicle, which is they do have streaming. You can do 140 signature streaming with Chronicle, but after that, you're stuck with either a 10-minute, 1 hour, or 24-hour frequency in it.
Right.
So even they can't handle the data as it's streaming in. And so this is really where the industry is going. We want these alerts in real time, but it's really hard to create these infrastructures that do it.
Yeah, and I think that the 2 points there, one is we're going to detect it in real time, right? Which is what streaming analytics gets us. But then to your point, Chris, if you're detecting it in real time, you can kick off your automations that respond in real time. And so instead of having the Mandiant report lately said it's 10 days of dwell time for a ransomware event and 20 days for a non-ransomware event. We could dive into that in another podcast. But the thing to keep in mind is if I'm living in your environment for 10 days and I'm a bad guy, it's too late. And so with streaming analytics, I catch it quicker. And with automation, I get rid of it quicker.
Yeah.
And so that dwell time starts to shrink to a number that makes it increasingly difficult for the bad guys to get in. And guess what? If you are doing this, they're not going to come to your company, and they still may. But if you're good at detecting and remediating or mitigating, then they're going to go after someone else who's low hanging fruit instead of you. And honestly, I think this is the way we're going to get ahead of the ransomware events that we're seeing.
Well, Chris, you alluded to the impact of AI and cybersecurity. So the last question as we kind of wrap things up, what is the future of AI and cybersecurity in this whole idea of detecting and responding quickly and the quickest?
Yeah, so if you take a look at some of the technology AI-wise that's come out so far prior to RSA's conference, you're going to see that it was mostly about how do I talk to and do searches better. Crazy as it seems, your technical guy needs a tool to ask technical questions. So it really is not as much of a wow factor for the person that's used to doing this. It's more a wow factor for management to say, oh, look how easy it could have been to do these searches if I knew the right questions. Now, there are changes, though. There's two things that you're seeing in AI in the security industry. You're seeing actually a lot of companies building things to address AI, like deepfake. So what you're seeing is a lot of anti-AI technology coming to market. Now, when it comes to analyzing data, our bread and butter on this call, there's a couple. There's I think the winner of today's RSA Sandbox was a company called Dropzone AI, or they were in it, I should say. And what Dropzone does is they use it. Now I'm going to use a techie term. I know it sounds like I'm not allowed to. LLM RAG, which basically is, we all understand large language models. The RAG stands for Retrieval Augmented Generation. And what that means is if it knows some facts, it's not going to make things up like your chat GPT, and it's going to go back to the facts to make a better decision.
Wow.
So that's great. The problem is that what is it doing? Well, it's searching the database. So yes, it's wonderful that now I have this AI that can review so many problems, but its delay is it's limited to the number of investigations it can do by going to a database. So obviously we want to use enhancements of analysis ahead of time, and it's going to help us out. To tell you the truth, there's some capability that says I'm going to look into this problem, but here's the reality. The reality is that before you get to this massive, wonderful AI solution, you should be definitely looking at dealing with people that know how to use SOAR technology. SOAR is the great multiplier, because the person who writes that response knows what they're doing. They know, oh, I have a virus, let me make sure it was properly killed, make sure it was properly quarantined. Were there any other activity? And they can write a process to help address this. And that is way more powerful than an AI trying to guess what to do, because this person's seen it 1,000 times over. They know exactly the proper way to do it. You don't want to have LLM do surgery on you, okay? It's going to be guessing, and it's going to be doing the most common things.
Yep.
The whole thing about personal medicine and everything is it's personal, and that's the same thing with response. Knowing proper response requires actual intelligence, not probability intelligence.
David, before you add to it, I want to make sure our viewers and our listeners know SOAR stands for Security Orchestration Automation Response. Got to make sure so I don't get any nasty email saying that I use an acronym.
Right.
All right, David. So your final thoughts, Chris. Thanks for sharing that. That was great.
Mm-hmm. I think for our listeners, the thing to keep in mind is you are in this industry and maybe you're starting your journey or you've been here a while. Two things. One is the industry evolves every day, and what used to be the best is no longer the best. And so you can't be stuck on your stack, right? Find the best tools, deploy the best tools, because the bad guys are doing the very same thing. And number two, SIEM technology is evolving. You're going to start to see all of the analyst groups out there talking about observability pipelines because they know the same problem we know, which is large data lakes, data files, databases take forever. And your ability to get ahead of an event is predicated on how quickly you catch it. So observability pipelines has to be the way to go.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much to our guest, Chris Jordan. Thank you to our listeners for joining us. If you have feedback or any questions about today's episode, please reach out to David or myself. We'll even get you in contact with Chris if need be. Just email us at podcast@highwirenetworks.com or leave a comment. And be sure to join us for our next episode, coming to you from Warsaw, Poland, the special international edition of Cybersecurity Simplified. Until next time, I'm Susanna Song.
And I'm Dave Barton.
And you're listening to Cybersecurity Simplified. From all of us here at Overwatch by Highwire Networks, thank you for listening. Don't forget to subscribe to the podcast, rate the episodes you enjoyed, share, and leave us a comment. We'll catch you next time on the Cybersecurity Simplified podcast. Remember, the more you know about cybersecurity, the safer you'll be. To learn more, visit us at highwirenetworks.com/podcast.